For the ones who know safety isn't a catchphrase, it's a culture. And the ones who help make sure everyone makes it home safe. For the safety-minded who watch everyone's backs, Grainger offers supplies and solutions for every industry, as well as safety assessments and training to keep your facilities safe and your people safer. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Welcome to Heard Tell. Okay, let's go back overseas, talk a little bit of some really interesting stuff going on in the UK that, yes, it's a little different, but there's some universal principles to apply there. Got Jack Rowlett back with us, Young Voices contributor. He's a writer and commentator coming to us from Nottingham, England, of Robin Hood fame. How are you, sir?
I'm good, thank you. It's good to be here. Looking forward to discussing Britain.
Yeah, I am too. So you got to mess with the NHS National Health System going over there right now. Everything from ambulance response times, you got nurses' strikes. Now you've got a doctor's shortage. This looks like a real big hot mess on the outside, but the real problem with this is the more you look at it, doesn't look like there's a lot of solutions coming anytime soon on some of these issues.
Yeah, I mean, it's top of the political agenda here at the moment. And something that's interesting is in this country, we sort of look down our noses at America, and you guys you don't have universal healthcare, and your healthcare outcomes are determined often by whether you've got a job, how much money you have, and we sort of we have this real sense of superiority in Britain that we have this free at the point of use healthcare and everybody has access to it. But actually now, increasingly, because of the state of the healthcare system, I don't think we can really claim to be a country with universal healthcare anymore. I've been in accident and emergency in Nottingham recently, and you've got people on beds in corridors, you've got people sleeping on the floors, you've got, wait times of days now in some cases for accident and emergency care. And we've got I think it's about 500 people a week currently dying purely because of the extended wait times for accessing care. And in terms of the solutions, I think there are a couple of problems here. One of which is that it sort of has to get worse before it gets better. And so I think that's the dynamic of us feeling like we can't really make it better, like there's no solutions to the problem, because actually there's nothing that's going to make it better tomorrow. But there are a number of things that we can do reasonably quickly. So one thing that's being talked about a lot over here is that we could allow pharmacies to prescribe medication, because they're not allowed to do that. So for kind of less serious illnesses, you would be able to go to your pharmacy rather than your doctor and get a prescription for some medication from them. And that's we've got a big problem with wait times for doctor's appointments as well, so that would help out with that as well. And then other solutions, like the fact that the NHS model really focuses on acute care, and it doesn't focus enough on making sure people are fit and healthy in general, and so preventative care. And so there's a lot of talk about how we really need to transition to focusing on that sort of care as well, because then you avoid this sort of crisis happening in the first place if you have a fitter, healthier population.
Yeah, Jack Rowlett joining us. Let's have the grown folk talk about this, though, is because too much when you're talking policy-wise, like when we're talking on a show like this or we're writing a piece, some of our friends use universal health care or government health care or single payer, whatever terminology you want to use, almost like it's a magic word, like, oh, we'll just have universal health care and it fixes everything. Whatever system you're advocating for, if it's not well administered, it really doesn't matter, because you're still going to have problems with it. And that's where this thing kind of falls apart, is like, look, it's not a magical incantation. If you're going to have universal health care, there are trade-offs to it. You're going to pay much higher taxes. You're going to have limited options on your health care. You're going to have those trade-offs, but it is free and everybody gets it. We just don't want to have those full discussions past the buzzwords sometimes. Like you just said, you've said it for so long. Well, we have universal health care. You don't. This is the risk of it in inertia. If you don't administer it, it really doesn't matter, does it?
Yeah, I mean, if it's free but terrible, then there's not much point in having it at all. And ultimately, somebody does have to pay. And that's the sort of difference is ultimately care in America is rationed just as it is here. It's just here it's being rationed at random in a healthcare system that's sort of crumbling all around us, whereas in America it's more rationed on the basis of your income or your job, right? And here there is a real, we often say in the UK that the NHS is the closest thing we have to a national religion. Like that's the sort of cult-like status it has in the national psyche. And for a long time, any talk of reforming it at all immediately leads to suggestions that you want to replace it with an American style system and that you want to privatize it and you're going to sell off the NHS to private American pharmaceutical and medical companies. And so there are all these roadblocks to reform. And it's a lot of it is driven by the politicians, because as soon as you have one party say, okay, well, the NHS is a mess, we need to reform it, let's do A, B, and C, the other parties come along and say, no, you want to privatize the NHS, they're going to destroy it. If you want to save the NHS, you've got to vote for us at the next election. And so nothing ever changes. But I think right now, the scale of it is just unimaginable. I don't think people really imagined that we'd reach a point in this country where you are ringing 999 for an ambulance and potentially it just doesn't come and you end up dying in your home, or your loved one ends up dying. And so I think now there is something of a changing attitude, and people are acknowledging that maybe we do need a change to our healthcare system, and that maybe even I think our attachment to universal healthcare is resolute, but that maybe this model of universal healthcare just doesn't work with the aging population we have.
Jack Rowlett joining us. See, this is the problem in healthcare in America: is the older you get, the more expensive you get. We're talking about the business side of it now. The older you get, the more expensive you get. And we have an insurance-heavy model for good, bad, or indifferent. So, the young people have to pay into it, although they're not using as many services, broadly speaking, to take care of the older people. That's the problem. You already mentioned it. For folks that aren't familiar with the national health system, it was built, it's a post-World War II thing heavily. That's kind of the model. It was designed for that Britain, because that was the Britain that existed then, the UK more broadly. That's not the UK that exists now. There is the talk that it didn't keep up to the times as it was supposed to, that focused on acute care, not focused on things like preventative care or long-term care or even palliative care for the elderly. That's where you start getting into the nuts and bolts medical policy problems here. And that's where a lot of the debate is, isn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, it's been flawed since the start, because you mentioned it's a post-war model of healthcare. It's absolutely right. It was started in the late 1940s, but actually the expectation of the government that brought it in was you would cut healthcare spending in the medium and long run as a result of bringing in universal healthcare, because you'd treat people and so their conditions wouldn't get worse. But actually what happened was the sheer scale of demand meant that actually healthcare spending has just risen inexorably since then. And we've reached a tipping point now because of those sort of demographic issues. We've got so many people sort of over the age of 60 and not enough young people paying taxes in. And we've also, we're rolling up the drawbridge and not letting as many immigrants into Britain anymore. So that tax base is shrinking. And so demand on the NHS is just increasing inexorably as that tax base shrinks. And no one has thus far been willing to reckon with this difficult problem and actually explain to the public, well, okay, you've got the options of either we carry out a massive reform, either everyone just goes private and poor people no longer have access to healthcare, or people pay a lot more in taxation. And these reforms and ideas aren't always popular here, because it's really hard to reform the NHS because of its place in the national psyche. But actually it's so urgent now. It's so urgent. You've got, toddlers sleeping on floors in accident and emergency departments. You've got pensioners waiting 4 days, pensioners with suspected heart attacks, waiting days for healthcare, dying on trolleys, people in car parks here receiving care in car parks because there's no capacity inside the actual hospitals themselves. We just need to do something about it and reckon with the difficult truth.
That's the sound of your current hype level at the gas pump. But brace yourself for something fuel nominal, because Unleaded 88 is about to take the hype to a whole new level. Unleaded 88 is cheaper, cleaner, and greener than regular unleaded. Plus, it's homegrown, making Unleaded 88 the clear choice at the pump and totally worth the hype. So pump it up with Unleaded 88, brought to you by Iowa Corn.
This is the story of the one. As a maintenance engineer, he hears things differently. To the untrained ear, everything on his shop floor might sound fine, but he can hear gears grinding or a belt slipping. So he steps in to fix the problem at hand before it gets out of hand. And he knows Grainger's got the right product he needs to get the job done, which is music to his ears. Call, click Grainger.com, or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.
Yeah, Jack Rolla joining us on Heard Tell. When we have these conversations, I always put my hands up and I was like, okay, I'll have the universal health care versus whatever debate with anybody you want to. I want to tell everybody two things about me, though. I lived overseas. I lived in Germany. I've been a German patient in the hospital. I've had a German ambulance pick me up. I know how that kind of model, the European model, works intimately. I've been there. I'm also a VA health patient, Veterans Affairs patient, which is the government-run healthcare system in America. So I know the good, bad, and difference of all of this. If you live in Germany, you get excellent healthcare. But what we would call the middle class in America, you're also paying in the 40 percentile of taxes plus a 19% VAT tax to pay for all that. If you pitched America on 60% taxes, they would tar and feather you and run you out of town. You just mentioned it with the UK. There's no model of reform for the NHS that isn't involving raising taxes, but you've got a population problem at the same time. That's a math problem that has got to be solved if you're going to actually fix the NHS, right? And that brings in immigration, it brings in politics, it brings in the culture war stuff. That's an ugly ball to try to unwind. But the result of that is an NHS where it's really hurting people.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And one thing people don't seem to often grasp about Britain is actually our healthcare system. It's not a straight European model. It's free at the point of use, and it's universal. So I think in America you often associate that with Europe, but actually it's quite different to how the rest of Europe works. We don't have any real insurance model at all, whereas countries like Germany and the Netherlands, for example, they do. It's a much more heavily regulated insurance model than you have in America, but there is a sort of social insurance system there. And so we, in a sense, we have the worst of all worlds with our healthcare system because it's massive and bureaucratic and run by the state. And you have all the problems that go along with that, but also the quality of care and provision of care is really bad as well. So it's a massive problem. And the demographics that you've just mentioned, I mean, that is the biggest thing now. And actually it does go broader than the NHS. You mentioned immigration and the cultural stuff and everything. There is a real generational divide here in the UK now. And actually part of improving public services, so the NHS, education, all those things, part of that is making tough choices about letting more immigrants in and encouraging people to have more children, and making policy more pro-family, because that's how you increase the size of the tax base in the short and medium term, and that's how you fund good public services. And what's most interesting is that the very people who rely most on the National Health Service, the sort of over 60s, over 65s, those people are the most unwilling to confront those difficult choices and make Britain a more pro-family country and make Britain a more pro-immigrant country. And it's a cycle of despair.
Yeah, Jack Rowlett, we have the same problem here with what we call the boomer generation. But we'll get into that some other time. Let's talk about that right there, though, because this is where this starts to cross streams into some other areas of policy. That young cohort, let's just say 18 to 25, post-school, post-university, that group, we're seeing some very troubling data post-COVID coming out of the UK. They're having trouble getting jobs, and they're having trouble getting housing. You talked about the immigration problem. Look, it's an either-or formula. You either have a high birth rate or you got to have immigrants if you're going to have an economy. You got to have one or the other. The people you do have can't get work and can't get housing to start their own lives and start their own, housing is equity. Housing is wealth. These are building blocks to your economy that we don't talk about as much as we do, like the unemployment rate. This is really troubling stuff for the UK, though, because the building blocks of the future economy for the next generation don't look real good right now.
No, they look terrible. And if I look at people my age who are looking to get on in life, smart people my age, all of them are looking at leaving Britain because they don't think that there are opportunities here and they don't think the country is serious about improving things. Housing is a real barrier. The state of housing in the UK right now is a disaster on so many levels. You have the level that it's really hard to buy for first-time buyers. The cost of housing relative to average wages is it's about 9.5 times higher, the average house price, compared to the average annual wage. And in London, it's something like 20 times higher. It's ridiculous there. And if you go back to the 1970s, it was about 3 times the average annual wage. So objectively, in real terms, the cost of housing has gotten so much more expensive over the past half century or so. And then also that's now spilling over into the rental sector. So for a long time, you've had a situation where younger people, people in their 20s and 30s have struggled to afford housing, but there was plenty of rented accommodation that they could find and stay in. And it's not desirable for people to be relying on that forever, but actually at least you had somewhere you could go. Now we're in a situation where there's such a dire shortage of rented accommodation in lots of our cities, particularly university cities. We have students coming into cities and there's, waiting lists for accommodation. There's queues all the way around the block to look around apartments. You have situations where landlords are actually renting apartments to the highest bidder, as in the person who can pay the most rent per month, rather than having a predetermined set amount. And when you actually get into this accommodation, a lot of it is really run down. It's really bad. It's damp, it's moldy, it's cold. And so the quality of housing is really low. And because there's such a shortage, it means although we have laws around kind of minimum provisions that you have to have for accommodation in the UK, actually your power as a renter is minimal, because you can go to your landlord and complain about something, and the landlord's response will often be, well, okay, move out then. But you can't go anywhere else because there's nowhere else in your price range. You see your friends who are having to move back in with their parents because they can't even rent somewhere. Not that they can't even buy somewhere, they can't even rent somewhere. That's how bad it's gotten. And then that spills over into this intergenerational problem, in that you have boomers here who own all the property essentially, and they block new property from being built, particularly in the places we most need it. And so again, that cycle of despair, it just gets worse and worse and worse and worse. That leads to less children being born. It leads to lower productivity. It leads to lower tax take, and that makes public services worse, and it makes Britain a less dynamic and versatile economy.
Yeah, Jack Rowlett joining us. The reason I bring that up is because you said Britain is under a generational change. Generational change comes whether you want it to or not, right? There's no stopping it. That's the tide of time when it comes to people. Generational change can be good or it can be bad. We're looking at these economic problems. We're looking at the NHS problems. We're looking at the political upheaval in Parliament right now in the UK. It doesn't look like this is going to be good generational change if you don't solve some of these problems. You have a urban and rural problem. The highest unemployment for the youth is in the West Midlands, the Birmingham, the old industrial sectors. It seems like there needs to be some pretty bold action here to cut off this whole generation going in a bad generational change instead of good generational change. But is there any movement to try to actually do anything about it?
There's lots of grassroots campaigns, but at the top of politics, nothing is changing. I mean, our government has just made it harder, in effect, to build housing by abolishing housing targets that were placed on local authorities here, which means there's even less incentive for local councils here to build housing than there was before. And we already weren't building enough. Taxes here have been risen to the height. They're now at the highest level they've been since the Second World War. And if you look at where the tax burden falls, it's on working people and working young people, and not on older people. And so money is increasingly being given out to older people in the form of benefits from the state. And it's money from younger people that's funding that, except that the kind of the usual dynamics of history have been reversed. If you go back sort of 40 years, older people were tended to be in poverty at a much higher rate than the working age population. Now it's reversed. We have more than a third of pensioners here are millionaires, and the percentage of pensioners, retirees in poverty, is considerably lower than the working age population now. And so things are being constantly rigged in their favor. We have here what we're dubbing the cost of living crisis now, because the cost of energy is so high. And one of the things that the government's doing to help out with that is they're giving out payments direct to households, like a sort of amount taken off the bill of your energy. And yet more money just goes to pensioners for that handout than anyone else. And it's not means tested at all, whether you're a rich pensioner or a poor pensioner. If you're old, you get a big handout from the state to help you with your energy. If you're a young person on a 0 hours contract with a load of college debt who's struggling to pay their soaring rent, you get a lot less. And so the problem for the government is their voter base is almost entirely the over 65s now. So there's no political impetus for them to make things better for younger working age people.
Yeah, Jack Rowland, that's a universal problem. Every country has that problem. The older people are going to have more political power because they got more money, more assets, whatever. That's not new. However, you do have one advantage in England where you have a parliamentary system with, outside some very specific judicial review, what Parliament says goes. You don't have a written constitution, so whatever Parliament does, that goes. You could have some pretty sweeping change here if there was a political appetite for it. How much has the chaos of the last year or so really crippled people's belief in Parliament? And I'm not just talking Labour versus the Tories and that sort of stuff, just the chaos in general. That's where it really starts kind of hurting, is because where you would look to Parliament like, okay, it's time to do some sweeping change here. And you're changing prime ministers every 5 minutes, and you're just kind of sitting around waiting for the Labour to get their turn. And you're probably not real super hyped that the Labour's going to do a whole lot. That's a big problem of faith in government you've got when you really, really need them to be able to steady the ship, right?
Yeah, I mean, the system's totally breaking down now. And if you look historically, when one party gets tired, there's tended to be a politician from the other party who is a kind of radical, dynamic leader who people can get excited about and get behind. And actually, if you talk to people in the UK now, no one feels excited about any of them. They're all terrible. They're or not terrible necessarily, but there's just a kind of apathy, right? You either hate politics or you just feel apathetic towards it here. And people look towards Parliament, and they look at, we've had scandals involving expenses, we've had scandals involving drugs recently, we've had scandals involving sexual harassment in Westminster, and people just look at them as sort of reflecting the worst of Britain rather than the best of Britain. And so, yeah, I think people's faith in our politicians to actually get us out of this rut is very low right now.
Yeah, I had a Labour friend quip to me, like, if all due respect to Keir Starmer, he said, if we had a Labour leader worth anything, he'd be king instead of Charles after 3, conservative prime ministers having to resign in disgrace. Just, it's stuff like that. Like, nobody seems to be able to even capitalize on the other side not being able to do anything. That's kind of, I'm an outside observer. You tell me, you're there. But when you can't take advantage of your political opponents absolutely shooting themselves in the foot, I don't inspire a whole lot of confidence to me. I'm not picking a side. I'm just saying it looks bad. It looks chaotic. And it looks like even when this, whenever you do have a general election this year, this fall, whenever that eventually happens, if Labour takes over, I don't really see anything really changing.
Yeah, I mean, it should be stated that Labour are well ahead in the polls here at the moment. And Keir Starmer, for an opposition leader, is pretty popular. But there's that lack of enthusiasm. People are just kind of trundling along saying, well, it's time for a change now. Conservatives have been really bad. Labour can't be any worse. There's no enthusiasm whatsoever. But I think one interesting dynamic as well is that actually the last time Labour came into power, they did so on the back of a really strong economy. And so when they came in, there was lots of money to throw around on public services. There was lots of money to sort of improve things for lower earners, lots of money to spend on tax credits, child benefit, all these sorts of things. When Labour inevitably, I think, win the next general election, whenever that is, and it has to be before January 2025, we're going to have just come out of a quite long and deep, and relatively shallow recession on the back of a decade of really stagnant economic growth. And so there's just not going to be money to change anything. I think we're looking at a wasted decade for Britain, really, now. In the 2010s, it was really cheap to borrow, and we chose to cut capital spending. We chose not to build more housing. We chose not to confront climate change. We chose not to confront our generational crisis and the pressure that puts on public services. And now we're in the next decade, a decade of high inflation, of higher interest rates, of real downward pressure on growth. And we're sort of left with very few options but to sort of try and push forward and make things better in the 2030s. It really feels like there's no real change that you could make really soon that would improve things, because there's no money and there's so many structural problems in the UK now.
Folks, if you've listened to the Heard Tell program, you've heard our friend Gabriella Hoffman, but you need to make sure you're checking out her podcast, District of Conservation. It's a podcast exploring the nuances of true conservation efforts from DC and beyond. From topic discussions to exclusive interviews with conservation and energy newsmakers, Gabriella keeps listeners appraised of the latest news stories while elevating important voices. Listen to District of Conservation on Apple Podcasts or wherever podcasts are played. Folks, you've heard of Ethan Brown on the Heard Tell show a couple of different times, but if you're interested in learning about how to discuss things like climate change without all the politics and doom and gloom, head over to his podcast, The Sweaty Penguin. Sweaty Penguin is a late-night comedy-style climate podcast working to add nuance, critical thinking, humor, and hope to the climate conversation. They got over 100 episodes already, breaking down weekly news stories and specific topics, from the vanilla to the ADHD to the international accountability to orangutans. Yes, I know, it's a comedy thing, so just go with it. But each time, exploring different ways we can make progress on these issues while still helping the economy, health, security, and everything else we care about. If you feel overwhelmed, exhausted, or excluded by today's climate change discourse, this is the podcast for you. Find The Sweaty Penguin wherever you get your podcasts or at www.thesweatypenguin.com.
Jack Rawlett joining us. That sounds bleak. For those of us, look, we got our own best in America. I'm not going to pretend like we don't, especially with what's going on in Congress right now, and we're in a presidential election cycle for 2024 ourselves. So we will share some guffaws if you want to send them our way, to be fair. What does and doesn't break through media, especially across the pond here? What's a few things for us, maybe the international audience, the American audience, or even the British audience? What should we be watching for beyond the headlines, beyond just PMQs, beyond just the nurses' strikes and rail strikes? What's a couple things we should be watching for as this year starts to unfold? Is it maybe having the election early? Is it maybe a new leader rising up through the ranks? What are you watching for that we should be watching in the headlines underneath all the noise?
I think what's really interesting at the moment is Brexit, which has been out of the news for a couple of years now since we left the European Union. But what's really interesting now is people are turning against it here. We sort of have nearly 60% of the population saying that it was a mistake to leave the European Union, and only around a quarter of the population saying that they think Brexit's going great. And we know from sort of trade figures that we're one of the only countries, one of the only major economies where our levels of international trade haven't recovered from before the pandemic. And it's been long enough since we came out of COVID lockdowns now that we can sort of say that might have something to do with Brexit. We've got problems at the borders. We've got problems in Northern Ireland. You know, the Northern Irish Protocol still isn't sorted out. And I think for a long time, the kind of Brexit wars was like an aspect of the culture wars, and it was a real 50-50 split. Now it feels like people are decisively turning away from Brexit, or certainly this hard, detached view of Brexit, and are actually more in favor of a closer relationship with Europe. And I think that will have an interesting effect on politics, because the Conservatives have massively tied themselves to the strongest, hardest form of Brexit possible. But Labour have also kind of become a party of Brexit as well. Since the last general election, they're saying, well, we're not going to join the EU. We just want to make Brexit work. We don't want to get that much closer to Europe. And so I think that's the interesting dynamic, is what effect will that have on British politics as that stops being, as the kind of the 50-50 divide between Remainers and Leavers here stops being a thing. And instead, people increasingly are not necessarily wanting to rejoin the EU, but are really dissatisfied with how Brexit has turned out.
Yeah, Jack Rawlett joining us. Let's be adults here, though. That sentiment and undoing Brexit after the decade of getting to Brexit, that's two very different things. And plus, that's not up to just the UK anymore. We saw what the EU did since Britain and the UK has left. They're not exactly going to gift wrap a basket full of provisions for you to come back either. That could be even worse of a situation. There's a lot of mess there if they ever decide to try to go back down that hallway again. I wonder how much taste there would be for that if they actually tried to do it.
Yeah, I think that's one of the big barriers, is that I mean, if I were the EU, I wouldn't really want us back at this point. And I don't think there's much suggestion that we'd go in to Europe.
Oh, they
again,
want you
that's-
back, but they're going to want you on your knees crawling
Yeah,
back.
well-
And economically, everything's going to be 70-30 their way, which I'm not sure that really fixes anything for the UK. I'm just being real about it. Like, if I was them, I'd do it too. It's like, sure, we'll have you back, but everything's going to be in our favor this time.
Yeah, and they'd want us to join the euro and possibly Schengen as well. So we would lose a lot of the advantages we had last time we remembered the EU. But what I think could happen is there could be a move towards sort of a form of associate membership. So trying to join the single market. So rather than going back into the EU, just having a closer relationship with Europe's institutions. Again, the terms that Europe might demand from us if we tried to do that might be too high a price to pay. But I think there is an increasing sort of understanding in Britain that maybe either Brexit was a mistake or we've just messed Brexit up really badly. I think that's increasingly becoming the consensus here.
Yeah, interesting times we live in, my friend, for our friends across the pond, Jack Rowlett, one of our great Young Voices contributors. He's a writer of commentary. He's all over the place. Great talking to you. Before we get you back again, let folks know where they can keep up with you, what you got going on, and how they can follow you until we talk to you again on Heard Tell, my friend.
So you can find me on Twitter at Jack_nostalgic, and you can find all my articles there, all my latest writing, latest appearances on British television and radio as well, and keep up to date with my thoughts on British and global politics.
Yep, there's a lot of stuff on housing, which is really important stuff to pay attention to, because I know we all got sick of infrastructure, but that's the infrastructure stuff that matters. Pay attention to it. Jack Rowlett, thank you so much for the time, sir. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
This is the story of the one. As head of maintenance at a concert hall, he knows the show must always go on. That's why he works behind the scenes, ensuring every light is working, the HVAC is humming, and his facility shines. With Grainger's supplies and solutions for every challenge he faces, plus 24/7 customer support, his venue never misses a beat. Call quickgrainger.com or just stop by. Grainger, for the ones who get it done.